Hello, everybody. I'm Luis Villarroya, board member of FIDIC and president of the Spanish engineering firm FTSA. On behalf of the FIDIC board, I would like to welcome everyone to today's webinar on de-risking and leveraging infrastructure investment, helping the private sector fill the funding gap. FIDIC is grateful to infrastructure engineering software company Bentley Systems, who are the sponsors of this event, and we would like to thank them for their support on this and previous FIDIC webinars. Today's webinar will be discussing the crucial issue of investment for large-scale infrastructure projects and how such investment can be de-risked, among others, by international financial institutions, IFIs, like the multilateral development banks, in order to draw in private sector finance, thereby helping to fill the funding gap that we know exists for major infrastructure projects. Today's event has been organized by the FIDIC International Financial Institution Committee, with each chaired by Suraj Rana, Managing Director of the International Development Contractor DT Global. The committee does important work in working with international financing institutions to relate organizations in the development of policies, guidelines, and processes to improve financial management, procurement, and enable implementation of innovations and best practice. On webinar today has also been organized to provide a platform for IFIs to air their views and highlight the steps they can take to de-risk major investments in order to make major infrastructure projects more attractive and bankable for those organizations looking to invest in them. Approaches to reducing the infrastructure investment gap to be discussed at the webinar may include the use of public-private partnership, developing a regional approach to infrastructure, and developing new and better models for funding infrastructure to attract a wider range of investors. Our speakers today will include representatives from the World Bank, the Multilateral Cooperation Center for Development Finance, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, African Development Bank, as well as leading consultants active in this area of work and members of our committee. I'm looking forward to hearing from them shortly. I hope that you will enjoy today's webinar on what is an important topic for our industry. Please also make as many questions as you want to make to our expert panel. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's event, the chair of the FIDIC International Financial Institutions Committee and Managing Director of International Development Contractor DT Global, Suraj Rana. He will now introduce the speaker and take you through today's event. Suraj, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you for that succinct introduction. Good morning and welcome to our webinar on de-risking and leveraging investment, helping the private sector fill the funding gap. In today's session, we will delve into critical role of international financial institution IFIs in addressing the global infrastructure investment gap. With massive infrastructure needs come significant challenges, including limited public budget, climate change concerns, and rapid technological advancement. Our discussions today will focus on potential solutions offered by IFIs to mitigate these challenges and catalyze investments in infrastructure projects. Introducing you to the webinar theme, IFIs play a pivotal role in bridging the global infrastructure investment gap. By de-risking investments and leveraging various financial mechanisms, IFIs play a crucial role in attracting private capital to infrastructure projects. Today, we will explore strategies such as risk mitigation, blended finance, credit enhancements, and technical assistance, along with approaches like public-private partnership regional infrastructure initiatives, and innovative funding models. We are privileged to have such esteemed speakers with us today, each bringing a wealth of knowledge and experience in addressing the challenges and opportunities in infrastructure investment. So before I go to introducing the individual speakers, we will have a Q&A session after the presentation from each speakers. We will have Q&A session where you can pose your questions to our experts. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time during the webinar through the chat feature. Now, let's engage in insightful discussion and explore the strategies to unlock the potential of infrastructure investment for sustainable development. I would also like to remind you, we have the poll questions here. Which the attendees can respond to as you go through the session. Okay, we'll jump into our first speaker, Frederic Wiltmann. He's the Frederic is the head of program team at Multilateral Cooperation Center for Development Finance at Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and currently based in China. Frederic has over 2 decades of experience in project and program management, focusing on sustainable urban development, climate finance, and energy sector investment. He plays a key role in coordinating investment priorities and strategies at AIIB. I would now pass the floor over to Frederic.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon and a good evening here from Beijing. My intervention will be geared to maybe setting the scene, the overall challenges, and how the IFIs can address the challenge in planning for sustainable infrastructure. There are needs that are known that are huge in terms of access to energy, to transportation services, in terms of the global urbanization challenges and the ones linked to climate change concerns. And there are challenges that the IFIs can help address in unique ways. I would like to just address quickly 3 key challenges. One would be on coordinated financing. The second one would have to do with the IFI's role in ensuring the sustainability of the infrastructure investment. And a third role would be in helping ensure the capacity of the recipients in emerging market economies, the clients of the MDBs and IFIs. On financing, as we all know, and as is often said, the issue is really not a lack of financing. The issue is a lack of bankable projects. So how do we actually ensure quality bankable projects? And how do we ensure in this process that the private sector can co-finance these projects? So in this sense, there are several mechanisms that IFIs have put in place. There are funds available for technical assistance to prepare quality projects. One such fund is the Global Facility hosted by the World Bank. Another one is the MCDF, the Multilateral Cooperation Center for Development Finance, that is hosted by the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank in Beijing. These various facilities provide technical assistance to prepare projects upstream, and they propose products also for the downstream, upstream pre-feasibility, feasibility study type of support, readiness due diligence, and environmental and social safeguards, quality environmental and social impact assessments. They can do this for sovereign projects. They can do this for PPP or private sector projects. So public-private partnership transaction advisory can be funded by these facilities. Also, advisory services for climate facilities or funds, or setting frameworks for lines of credit from the IFIs to other financiers that may not be IFIs, but emerging market financiers. And downstream, other products would include technical assistance loans for advanced technical design, for instance, that would be reimbursable, guarantees, or credit enhancement products. The second point on sustainability is really to bring quality standards to the investments, and these are the so-called I5 standards on environmental and social frameworks. They also relate to procurement, to sustainability of the investments, and to Paris-aligned climate-positive infrastructure investments. To ensure these standards, these funds usually work with accredited partners to rigorous standards. An important part is to try and extend these standards to co-financiers that are not IFIs, that are emerging market financiers, and these could be policy banks, for instance, China Exim Bank or Turkish Exim Bank. They could be national development banks, the Development Bank of South Africa, for instance, or they could be commercial banks. And in co-financing projects with IFIs, they would adopt their prevailing standards on quality infrastructure. So this is an important effort to achieve at the same time volume and quality of the investments. And the last point on capacity building is the role of IFIs in the provision of quality programs to train these new partners in the adoption of these standards, and also to ensure a sense of regional cohesion in the adoption of these programs through regional capacity program that may have to do with trade finance or environmental and social harmonization, standards of harmonizations. For instance, in Africa, we've pushed for programs with the African Development Bank, with partners in Latin America and in Asia, on ensuring a regional approach to sharing knowledge on the standards that support quality infrastructure investments. I will stop here and hand over back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Frederic, for your insightful delivery on the challenges. So I will move on to our next speaker, Şebnem Erol Madan. She's the practice manager for Infrastructure Finance and Guarantees Group at the World Bank. With over 20 years of experience in structured credit markets, Şebnem specializes in infrastructure finance and guarantees. She leads the World Bank's effort in mobilizing private capital for infrastructure projects through financial structuring, credit enhancement, and technical assistance. Over to you, Şebnem, for your presentation, please.
Thank you very much, Suraj, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I won't go into the numbers. I think we all know that the financing needs for infrastructure development in emerging markets is very significant, in the multiples of trillions. And what we know is that the resources of IFIs, especially multilateral development banks, can only make up about 10% of the financing needed, which means it's really essential to mobilize the private sector. And I'm sure you all heard of the World Bank Group Evolution Roadmap. It is very much centered around the directional change in our programming due to the critical need to engage the private sector, not just for their capital, but also for the expertise and efficiency they bring to the table. Now, de-risking is an important part of this because, of course, these markets present significant risks. And we can see from past experience that for true de-risking, we really need to fix the fundamentals. Now, that calls for beyond, guarantee instruments and insurance products, but a more comprehensive upstream to downstream approach, starting with the enabling environment, building country institutions and capacity, sector fundamentals, macro, creditworthiness of counterparts through technical assistance and support to reforms. This is an important part of what the World Bank does. Frederic mentioned lack of projects, expanding the investable pipeline of opportunities in a scalable and replicable manner, especially, is critical. And of course, then our various instruments can come in to bridge the gap as these critical measures come through in terms of results on the ground. The World Bank Group offers a range of financial instruments, anywhere from grants, concessional loans, guarantees, insurance, project finance loans, and even equity investments. And these can all be part of a de-risking plan. In that context, the different entities within the World Bank Group work together in a complementary manner. I'm sure you all heard of MIGA. It mitigates public sector risks by providing credit enhancement and political risk insurance to support foreign direct investment. IFC can provide commercial risk guarantees for trade finance, loan portfolios, and private sector in general. And then at the request of its member countries, especially for higher risk and complex projects, either IBRD can come in to backstop public sector payment or performance risks with our concessional pricing and also honest broker role holding the hand of the government. And if need be, we can also provide concessional loans to projects as viability gap funding, which are another important element of de-risking. Now, mobilizing private capital, we sort of think of it along three main modalities when it comes to infrastructure projects. The first one, of course, is public-private partnerships. Their typical instruments are either IBRD payment guarantees, concessional loans for viability gap funding, and MIGA's political risk insurance. One current example is Uzbekistan, where IBRD has a deep and broad sectoral engagement in the energy sector, technical assistance, policy dialogue. At the back of this, IFC has been providing transaction advice to the government of Uzbekistan to bring private capital into their ambitious green generation program. And so far, we have provided, I think, $53 million in payment guarantees across 5 projects, mobilizing 2.4 gigawatts of power generation capacity and nearly 2 billion of investments, with more to come. Other MDBs like ADB and EBRD are also involved in this space. This has been, in our case, complemented by IFC lending. MIGA has provided political risk insurance to select projects. And Uzbekistan is on its way to install about 12 gigawatts of green generation capacity by 2030. So that's one example with public-private projects. Now, it's also essential to look at state-owned enterprises. They are critical, especially their creditworthiness, both as a counterpart to the private sector, but also, they also do projects. When we look at infrastructure, a lot of that is actually done through SOEs, and they need to have access to affordable commercial finance for these public investments. So the second modality we look at is mobilizing this affordable commercial capital for public investments. Here we have both MIGA's non-honoring product, and where these are not available, either IBRD's partial credit guarantees, often combined with secondary reinsurance, which can play a significant role. A good example of this is a water project I can talk about in Angola, which reached financial close in 2022. Public sector project with the objective of building and enhancing water supply to underserved areas of South Luanda. Here we deployed a $500 million IBRD guarantee, which supported close to $1 billion of investment, financed by 5 commercial banks, achieving long tenors and a very affordable cost. And all of this despite the very elevated sovereign risk concerns Angola experienced at that time. And the third and last modality I'll mention is risk-sharing facilities through financial intermediaries, where these can be very powerful in mobilizing local currency finance for smaller and medium-scale projects. And there can be many of these projects that require aggregation. And in India, in Vietnam, and even in Africa, we're looking at a number of these. And they can apply across different sectors, such as rooftop solar, distributed renewables, compressed biogas, energy efficiency, even industrial decarbonization. So let me wrap up here. In conclusion, the World Bank Group is committed to de-risking and leveraging infrastructure finance through a holistic approach upstream to downstream, with a strong emphasis on technical assistance to our government clients across the project cycle and our suite of products which can mitigate different types of risks for a wide range of investors. And we look forward to partnering with other MDBs with the private sector closely in doing so. Thank you very much. Over to you, Suraj.
Thank you, Şebnem. Again, that was very, very sort of resourceful, a lot there to digest. I'm sure our speakers, audience have been picking a few interesting points there. I will now move on to our next speaker from African Development Bank. Wale Shonibare is the Director for Energy Financial Solutions, Policy and Regulation at FDB. With a career spanning over 3 decades, Wale specializes in investment banking and consulting within the energy sector. He leads the FD's efforts in facilitating energy infrastructure investments and advancing policy and regulatory frameworks to attract private sector participation. Wale, over to you for more insight on your Africa market. Wale is joining us from Ivory Coast. So again, we have people all over who have taken time today to join this webinar.
Thank you very much, Suraj. I hope you can all hear me. The work that we do at the African Development Bank to promote the energy sector is quite wide-ranging. And as we know, we have over 600 million Africans without access to electricity. And so the bank has come out with some very aggressive targets in our new deal on energy for Africa, which looks at work that we can do both upstream as well as in terms of the enabling environment to support private sector as well as public sector investment in the energy sector, and the work that we do downstream in facilitating investment into the sector. So upstream, we look at a wide range of issues. For instance, in terms of regulation, the bank launched the first electricity regulatory index, where we benchmark the regulatory environment in all of the African countries against international best practice. And we identify gaps within the regulatory framework, and we use that to target technical assistance into those areas where there might be weaknesses. And we've seen some level of correlation between a functioning regulatory environment and the ability to attract private investment. So for instance, over the past 4 or 5 years, Uganda has come top in our annual survey, and there we see a fairly well-functioning market where the utility is well run and is financially sustainable. And you also see a situation in which you've had many successful IPPs. So after countries like South Africa and possibly, Uganda is possibly the country with the highest number of IPPs that have been successfully closed. And there's a reason for that, because you need to have, a creditworthy off-taker in order for your private sector investors to have confidence in the sector. And in terms of collections, the utility has to collect efficiently. You have to reduce the number of technical and commercial losses. And all of the sector value chain has to work. Oftentimes people focus just on generation alone, but it's not only about generation, it's about how well you're able to transmit the electricity, distribute it, and also collect from the end customers, the extent to which you're able to reduce things like energy theft. So the role of the regulator, we find, is very important. The other thing that is important is data. That's why we created the Africa Energy Portal, which provides detailed information about the energy sector in each of the African countries. And we also have a policy dialogue platform called the Africa Energy Marketplace, where we bring together the government at a very senior level, often ministerial, the private sector, and development partners, because donor coordination is absolutely key so that all donors are not trying to reinvent the wheel, and they are, supporting the country in ways that are complementary. But apart from that, I mean, there are many instruments that we have created in order to support investment. And one critical thing is the ability to invest in local currency, because you find oftentimes when you are collecting your revenues in local currency, many of our countries are financing in hard currency, and that's not sustainable in the long term, especially in countries where we've seen significant currency volatility. It's often difficult to pass that on to the end consumer. And so in a number of countries where the capital markets are deep enough and the financial sector is mature enough, we're pioneering the use of local currency instruments, and we've done that successfully in places like Nigeria, where we supported the Nigeria Infrastructure Debt Fund, which for the very first time allows project developers to borrow up to 15 years or more in local currency that is not available from commercial banks, who are restricted to maybe 7 years. You find that we need more of those products in certain markets. Luckily, places like South Africa, you're able to finance in local currency, but that does not apply in all of our countries. And we've also worked with the Green Climate Fund to bring in place climate finance to provide first loss as well as other credit enhancements to allow us to support local banks to be able to extend their tenors and to be able to lend in local currency. So I think the local currency issue is the elephant in the room, because this issue of lending in hard currency and then asking for government guarantees is not sustainable. Most of our countries are reaching the end of their ability to provide those guarantees. They're reaching their debt sustainability limits. And we have to look at the macro reforms, encouraging things like savings, to allow these countries to be able to do more projects. For Africa, attracting climate finance is absolutely fundamental, because the continent suffers from the disproportionate impact of climate change, having been responsible for less than 3% of global emissions. And there are different climate finance instruments that we have, the best known being our Sustainable Energy for Africa Trust Fund, where we focus on what we call green baseload, where we're enhancing grids in order for grids to be able to anchor more renewable energy. On top of that, we support distributed generation, solar home systems, in order to be able to increase energy access. And for Africa, clean cooking is a huge agenda for which we are also looking at innovative instruments. So across the board, it's very important. It's not just about money. The value chain has to work, the sector has to work, and you need structural solutions. Lastly, I think the work we're doing on regional interconnections is extremely important, because we want to move away from the single buyer model, where you're selling to a weak utility. That's often the cause of a lot of the instability we find in the financing, where your utilities are not creditworthy. And so by building the regional interconnections and training the power pools, we can support our countries to allow better regional trade and a more sustainable sector. I think I will stop on that point. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Wale. Really interesting insight into your local currency investment. I guess a lot to consider in there, especially in countries where you have, like you mentioned, the volatility of the currency, and countries where you don't have the capital market well developed. There are multiple things in the chain to develop. So I will now move on to our fourth speaker, Vera Monika, who is also our IFIC, FIDIC IFIC Committee Vice Chair, and she is a Senior Consultant at GOPA Infra. Vera is an international expert in water and wastewater projects, procurement, and project management. With extensive experience across various infrastructure sectors and regions, she brings valuable insights into public-private partnerships and project implementation. So let's hear from Vera what we have on more on the engineering consultant's view into this. Over to you, Vera.
Thank you very much, Suraj, and good afternoon. Yeah, I would like to rather shed some light from a consultant's perspective on PPPs or any kind of concepts that would foster the private investments into infrastructure projects. What I see is for a client who is looking into implementing infrastructure projects, it always looks very like having a less of headache to go for private investments, because we see that more and more infrastructure measures are needed and the budgets are getting smaller and smaller. So obviously a PPP sounds in the first place very nice if you can get somehow private money involved into infrastructure. So definitely one of the reasons why we are thinking of private investments. Plus also the aspect that maybe institutions, local institutions are looking into qualified operators for their facilities, might be very interesting in the water sector, in the electricity sector, when the institutions do not have their own qualified operators yet. So the idea of having that hassle-free option of involving private funds is that then really that less of a headache. And I have to say that from our experience, that we see that the efforts that are really required to set up a PPP until the eventual maybe water supply, wastewater treatment, electricity supply, whatever it is operating is a very long way. So it needs to be really carefully assessed and then carefully implemented. And when I look at the critical things, I would say there are 3 topics that need to be considered from institutions before they make a decision to have private funds involved. There is the time aspect, then there is the scope of the project, and related to it, the question, is it really bankable? And it is also the complexity of the stakeholders' interactions in such a PPP. So looking at the first point, when it comes to time, a PPP takes considerably longer than having the, I will call it now, the typical scheme of procuring design, build, or purely construction projects. It starts at the very beginning, where you need the investing entity that might set up later on the special purpose vehicle implementing the project. We will require then the bidders who are interested in doing this kind of work, starting from the funding, the design, the construction of the operation. The funds need to be secured from different sources. And of course, there is the requirement to have the capacities of designing, building, and operating all the facilities, considering also environmental and social safeguards. So if we look at the time frame, it is definitely much longer than a typical project, which is done on a design, build, or pure construction or EPC contract in a comparison to the PPP. Speaking of a scope of the project or the bankability, I would say it is definitely an aspect that needs to be considered, that not all projects are really suitable to opt for a PPP. Especially when it comes to small-scale projects, the efforts needed to have a PPP might not be in relation anymore to the outcome. Also, what I saw is one of the most critical items is the external conditions in the countries where the provision of the services or whatever it is, the infrastructure shall be built, is facing. It starts with, it was just mentioned, regulatory issues. There is local legislation. I will just give an example. If we look at a country, there was a suggestion to have a wastewater treatment plant with energy recovery by biogas generation from the sludge. That might be possibly a very nice idea and a promising PPP in a country where electricity cost is high, and there's also a willingness to pay for wastewater services. While at the other hand, if the same project would be suggested in countries where electricity is highly subsidized, or there's even no legal basis to collect funds for or fees for wastewater treatment, that might be an issue. So when looking at the option, should the PPP be selected, we see that very often the deeper knowledge is missing to really decide to take an informed decision on which type of investment can be made. And the third point, the complexity of the stakeholder groups and the interactions should not be underestimated. So there's a huge group, I have mentioned it, advisory, private entity, banks, law firms, insurance companies. So all these interactions need to be managed very carefully. So when I look at all the obstacles we see, and it was mentioned before, I see a very important step from the IFIs to support in capacity building of institutions who want to invest, to give them an idea which projects are suitable and which are not, to have really trainings to raise a certain awareness on this issue. And I think this is for us as consultants, because we come in very late only, the most important support that we can think of when it comes to the IFIs. Thank you very much. And back to Suraj.
Thank you, Vera. Again, very, very informative in terms of understanding how we consultants operate, especially in an environment where we're trying to convince the host government who have less knowledge or less understanding, and where the complexities, like you mentioned, about dealing with the investors, dealing with the bank, legal aspects and all, the framework isn't that sort of strong enough, and getting that through with the government isn't, again, easy task. I will now move on to our final speaker, Gregory Liu. Is the Acting Director General leading the Infrastructure Investment Department at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Gregory brings extensive international infrastructure finance experience, particularly in debt, capital markets, and credit ratings. His leadership in building investment portfolio across diverse sectors and regions is instrumental in addressing the infrastructure deficit. Over to you, Gregory, now.
Thank you, Suraj. Good afternoon and good evening, distinguished guests. I think the previous speaker have done a very well coverage on what products the IFI offers. So I will try to be short on the overall introduction of AIIB, if you haven't known the name before. We are a young bank formed in 2016. To date, we have 109 members, and we have an investment in 37 member countries of 50 billion. Roughly 60% of such investment goes to the infrastructure area. In the next few minutes, I actually thought maybe it's helpful to use a high-level case to show how IFI work together by using all the different products available and to de-risk in challenging market. I noticed earlier speaker mentioned countries like Uzbekistan. Since I cover both sovereign side of the financing and the non-sovereign side of the financing, so I would also use Uzbekistan as case to show what's the consideration that IFI have when we look at decarbonization, green infrastructure in a country with a sub-investment grade. From the word I use, you probably sense I also come from a commercial bank and investment bank background. I would say the difference when we look at it, is commercial bank would seldom go to sub-investment grade country to invest in long-term infrastructure without proper risk mitigation of the country risk, regulation risk, and changing law and other risk. But the value addition IFI have here is because the IFIs are owned by the government, so they can serve very well as the in-between partner, bridge the public side and the private side. I noted our consultant speaker mentioned PPP takes long time to materialize. So when we got invited to look in some gas-fired power plant, combined cycle gas-fired power plant in Uzbekistan, I noticed it took at least 3 years for the private sector developer from the Middle East to negotiate with the government, certainly with the IFI working on the sideline to explain what risk should be borne by which side. Thinking about Uzbekistan, it's a country, most populous country in Central Asia. It has a 35 million population, but the generation asset they use is very dated. So when IFI read their national decarbonization plan, we all know they need to build up the gas-fired capacity to replace outdated generating asset, and then they can put together the renewable capacity. So we take a longer-term view. We explain to the government it's difficult for them to mobilize so many commercial banks to take the country risk. There, we have peers like MIGA from the World Bank Group provide some cover to mitigate the country risk, while multinationals like AIIB, EBRD, and KfW, and these DFI work as a parallel lenders in the syndicate. So the risk is distributed across different type of financial institution. But the result achieved is for a country with a sub-investment grade, through the involvement of IFI, they achieve 18-year tenure, which is unusual for a country like Uzbekistan, which has a history of 35 years. So if you look at this context, you would know how the de-risk part work. And then I also want to touch upon the capacity building. We noticed not only the public sector, but also the private sector all need to have some capacity building. Some sponsors come from the EPC background, so they more think about the construction side and the operation side. But when they enter into such a new market, they realize there are project risk. Yes, the generation assets can be upgraded, but if the grid is not upgraded, the transmission loss is substantial. And the involvement of MDV means we actually help different stakeholders to identify different opportunities they can find in a challenging market like this, and then put the expertise behind all different segments along the value chain. I will stop here and pass the floor back to Suraj.
Thank you, Gregory. Good gain. There's a lot there. I'm sure we will have questions coming in from the audience. Now I will open up the floor for questions in the chat box, and we will sort of pick up from there to mostly to individual speakers. Before I go into individual questions in the box, I just wanted to personally ask one question to Frederic, because he's got the program and project background of managing the portfolio. It would be interesting to understand some flagship project that he may have handled in the region or ongoing, anything to do with the climate finance project, and where IFI has really, or AIIB, ADB in your previous tenure, where you would have sort of managed, de-risked the project. It would be useful to understand both on the upstream as well as downstream work that may have been carried out throughout the chain, just to understand how the investment has been unlocked into, say, a emerging economy around in the region that you operate. Over to you, Frederic.
Thank you, Suraj. One large flagship project that comes to mind in the region is a Green Climate Fund investor project that was brought to the GCF about 4 or 5 years ago by the Asian Development Bank. The idea was to pool concessional resources from MDBs and bilaterals. ADB was one, the French agency Agence Française de Développement was another, the German agency KfW, and the GCF. Together, they provided over 400 million of concessional loans that went through a sovereign guarantee into China. So the country was China, to the Ministry of Finance, and the project was set in Shandong province. Shandong is the large coastal province south of Beijing, north of Shanghai, that has pollution challenges. It's a large industrial province, so it was a good candidate for a large-scale project. The idea was to try and de-risk investments by private, institutional, and commercial capital investors using the concessional resources from the GCF being the cheapest, and the concessional from KfW, AFD, and ADB for eligible sectors in the province. So it's not an R&D type of fund, it's not venture capital, it's technologies that are eligible by sector following taxonomy that is aligned with the requirements of the Green Climate Fund. It's projects that are in theory commercial, so not R&D anymore, but that have not been tested before, so that need de-risking to bring in private institutional commercial type of investors. So what the project did together with the teams at the GCF in Korea was to first establish, baselines. So there's a taxonomy, that is the taxonomy of the Green Climate Fund, and there's an investment framework, green investment framework, that is the green investment framework of the GCF that applies globally, that tells you which sectors are eligible, renewables, transport, so forth, for both mitigation type of infrastructure investment and adaptation type of infrastructure investments. So baselines were first devised for the province by sector, because without a baseline, you cannot really measure the benefits of the projects in terms of its climate impact, in terms of mitigation, essentially for baselines, but also in terms of number of people affected in terms of the adaptation projects. And so several sub-funds were set up in the province. So the 400+ million became 1.7 billion, pooled together with private institutional and commercial capital, pooled together with also resources from the provincial government. And then sub-funds were set up, some for certain municipalities in Qingdao, in Weihai, in other key cities. And the interesting feature is, so the available concessional would de-risk the projects and guarantee an investment rate of return to the private partners for 6 to 7 years. And once the technology has proven itself, following a known mechanism, then the concessional is returned to the fund and the project is completely refinanced on commercial terms. What the project also did is distinguish between different types of technologies. So there is the ones that are just eligible because they bring in benefits relative to the baseline. And there are ones that bring larger benefits that are a little bit more advanced in terms of the technology, but the risk is perceived also as higher. These projects were classified as advanced benefits. For those projects, the interest rate was more beneficial, and so was the tenor. And that was, you know, thanks to the concessional resources brought by the 4 sovereign investors. And then there was a third pool of projects called transformational that really brought much larger benefits potentially, and also would create new markets for new technologies in the province. So this was very instrumental in bringing a lot of new tech to the Shandong market. It was picked up by a large fund manager. So the Asian Development Bank is not managing this with CICC Capital linked to Morgan Stanley, is now managing this fund. And it's been quite successful at, you know, de-risking a number of projects already with the concessional resources provided by the 4 sovereign financiers. This is not a unique example, but that's the largest in China that I'm aware of, and the only one that GCF supported in China. But there are others in the region. There's a large ASEAN green finance catalyst facility that was also proposed by the Asian Development Bank, and that also has GCF funding in it. It's very large. It's beyond 2 billion now, this one, and it's doing similar de-risking, but for the entire countries of the ASEAN, the Southeast Asian nations. There are other such examples in Africa. Wale explained, you know, how the AFDB is working with the GCF. The GCF has also worked with the Development Bank of South Africa on private sector side with the 5 commercial banks in setting up an investment framework for eligible on lending to these commercial banks, South Africa and neighboring countries, including Botswana and Namibia. I think there's 5 of them. The Africa Finance Corporation in Nigeria, was a private sector lender in the continent, has also set up a large Africa climate finance facility with 250 million plus from the GCF, looking at the same de-risking, you know, private sector investments into climate finance, both mitigation and adaptation. The AFDB has a number of other initiatives beyond the involvement with the GCF, but that have to do with climate finance and also green finance in general, initiatives on green banks, developing the capacity of greening green credit lines for commercial banks in Africa. There's a large initiative, AFDB, that I'm aware of underway. Also, it's called Asia. I mean, Wale, correct me if I'm wrong. Asia Green.
Idea.
Green infrastructure.
Yeah. Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa.
In Africa, exactly. This is another one that is pooling together equity investments with 100 million from AFDB as an anchor investor for project preparation and pipeline development, and then the equity investors bringing in another 400 million for eligible infrastructure projects. So there are many such examples to be presented here. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Frederic. We go to the question box and see one post for. I see one question directed to Vera. Vera, in addition to other challenges in PPP model, there is also a great risk of corruption. How can this be addressed? I guess Vera and others, I guess, could also look into
From my experience, I would say that especially PPPs with this very intricate system of stakeholders, the many eyes looking at this project, I had the feeling that corruption is, of course, in many projects, it's a topic, I have to admit, but I would say in a PPP, there are a lot of mitigation measures that can somehow prevent corruption. If I look at the many law firms involved, the many consultants involved, apart from the investing entities, all IFIs or general development banks have their own policies when it comes to fighting corruption. So I would say that in a PPP, I would expect the risk rather to be less compared to a typical construction project, which is procured between a local entity and maybe consultants supporting in the selection of a bidder. That is at least my experience or my feeling on that. Thank you, Suraj.
Thank you, Vera. Anyone from the panelists who'd want to add?
Suraj, maybe one thing to mention is the importance of competitive procurement, which certainly goes a long way in terms of bringing transparency and avoiding corruption, especially, assuming this is coupled very well with a strong due diligence approach.
Right. Thank you, Şebnem. Just adding to that, when you mentioned about the procurement, one of the things that I have been also working with the investment board in Nepal, is transaction advisory one option to that in terms of transparent procurement? Because when you're going through a transaction advisory through professional transaction advisor, a lot of things which Vera also mentioned earlier in her presentation in terms of identifying the project where the PPP is the right solution or what form of PPP, before that, what is the feasibility of the project and all. And then you're going through a process of market sounding and proper procurement. So would you really advocate for a sort of transaction advisor in countries to sort of go in as a block advisory?
Indeed, Suraj, I think you put it very well. That would exactly be the recommended process. I think a number of the panelists emphasize the lower capacity that we find in developing economies. So having good transaction advisors when doing a complicated procurement, such as for a PPP, and I would argue it is complicated because there are so many contracts, as a somewhat detailed preparation process as well, and a number of options to evaluate from different PPP models to, like you said, whether to do a PPP or not. Having a good transaction advisor is essential. It's also important that way that when these governments venture into doing PPPs, they have a good experience and they keep doing more of them in the right way. Because we all know one bad PPP spoils the market for everybody and leaves a very bad aftertaste in the country.
Thank you, Şebnem. Can I I'll move on to the questions in the chat box. The first one just goes into from Manish Kothari from USA. He's our FIDIC board member. He's basically posing a question to all of you, I guess, quickly. Given growing global uncertainty and lack of trust, what and how can FIDIC play the role of trusted advisor and be the bridge between financial institutions and borrowing clients? In many cases, it is the government of a fragile economy. Again, how do you, it's so much, as probably I mentioned earlier, about sensitizing the government and bringing them to this understanding. What can FIDIC, how can FIDIC play that role?
Perhaps I should try and answer that, Suraj.
Yes, please.
Referring to the previous question on discussion around PPPs, I think as professionals, we have to be absolutely honest with governments that PPPs are not always the panacea to all their problems. And many governments also feel that PPP is like free money. There's no free lunch. I mean, there's usually, when it comes to utilities, infrastructure, there's usually a government obligation, and that may translate into contingent liabilities that government will have to factor into their borrowing limits. IMF usually, has some objections to some of these projects at times for heavily indebted countries. And in some cases, it's often easier for the government to borrow directly to undertake the project because some countries are so small that you'll probably only ever have one PPP project because the government just has very limited capacity to sign these guarantees and sovereign obligations, etc. So, and when you're talking about FIDIC, again, the members of FIDIC need to be aware that in some countries, you just don't have the necessary conditions. And that even applies to the banking sector. To what extent can the local banking sector sustain this transaction If not, that country ends up borrowing in hard currency, which they may not be able to sustain either if they have a very volatile currency. And we've seen several examples of that, of projects failing in the long term because of currency devaluation, fairly drastic. And our populations sometimes have affordability issues, to pay connection charges, to pay utility bills. You cannot always pass on those currency risks to the end public. You have social unrest when you revise tariffs, etc. So there's social issues, social political issues, and there are too many people running around promising PPPs in countries where PPPs are not going to work. And there needs to be some honesty. PPPs have their role. Even in developed economies, there's a limited role that PPPs can play. And I think the UK recognized that following their experiment with private finance initiatives. So I don't think there's sufficient honesty. Members of FIDIC can also help propagate what it means to implement PPPs, because you need a lot of discipline. There are many lawyers and contractual arrangements involved. It's very expensive for some countries. So I think, let me leave it there.
Thank you, Wale. Thank you. Let me move on to another question that we have here from Bavi Varde, if I'm pronouncing the name correctly. How does IFI handle and manage disputes for private investors, and what mechanisms are in place to address this situation? Is that something, Gregory, you could take?
Let me take it. I think what FI's handle of a dispute is broadly similar, like any financier's handling of the dispute. If you follow the common law system, you either go through the arbitrary or other procedure. But certainly, FI uphold a high standard on environmental, social, and procurement. So the mitigation perhaps also come from the front-loaded, more stringent due diligence to avoid the dispute at a later stage. But if there's a change in law introduced from the country, then we will still have to follow the normal procedure of handling dispute. But certainly, IFI has their preferred creditor status as the lender to the sovereign. Their voice probably will be heard clearer by the sovereign side. I stop here. Other colleagues from IFI background, please feel free to add.
Sorry, I'll move on to another question here. There are quite a few coming in. There's one from Helmut, who mentions, I learned the donors provide money and they leave all to the beneficiaries. So how do you check the compliance with the rules if they have no mandate? Donors provide all money and they leave all to the beneficiaries. So how do you check the compliances and rules? I guess it's one of you responding to how do you make sure the money that is is spent in compliance and regulation. I think to an extent, Gregory, you just responded to it, but if anybody wants to add in.
Yeah, perhaps Suraj, if donor money is channeled through NMDB, and I can speak for the World Bank, but I think it's similar or the same, in fact, across other MDBs. When we do a project, we do it according to a certain set of standards based on our policies and guidance. which do take account of a number of critical factors, such as, of course, due diligence is a big part of it, environmental and social standards are a big part of it, how the project is procured is an important part of it. And again, depending on the capacity of the governments, we might choose to use the government's own procurement systems or require that they use our procurement systems, again, to ensure better management of the funds and the project. So there are a number of policies in place to safeguard that firstly, any kind of negative externalities are avoided, but also that the beneficiaries actually benefit from the project and the value from the intervention go to the beneficiaries. There are also various scorecards and project development objectives and results indicators that come with these projects, and we periodically check performance against these. Hope that also helps answer.
Thank you, Şebnem. Thank you. I will move on to this long question from Jihad Daniel, is from Lebanon. Is basically pose a question to anybody who's had anyone from the panelists who've had experience of Lebanon directly. Is really posing a question about this economic and financial crisis that's kicked in Lebanon since 19, past COVID, and all this now still exaggerated with the Gulf War and all. What do you think? Will it recover? Are there any examples, similar examples of other countries getting back, bouncing back? So it's really a concern in terms of trying to understand what is the future there with Lebanon in terms of recovering back in its finance and economic recovery.
Suraj, what was the question?
The question is quite, well, I'll just read it. If anyone from the speaker being involved in Lebanon, brief, Lebanon has been assailed by the most devastating multi-pronged crisis in more unfolding economic and financial crisis that started in October 19 and been further exaggerated by the dual economic impact of COVID outbreak and then the massive port of Beirut explosion, which again, then the Lebanese-Israel war. Do you think that there is a way out for the country to recover from this? Is there an example from other country that faced similar case, and how many years would it take for measures that World Bank in cooperation with UN and the EU have established? Is there any example from other countries that maybe EU, World Bank, even African Development Bank, maybe AIB from Sri Lanka? I don't know, anything that you want to put in prospect?
I think we've seen the devastating effect of COVID around the world. I mean, African economies have felt it very keenly. We've seen the impact of the Ukraine war on food prices, for instance. We've seen the impact of rising inflation on currencies, where we've experienced significant devaluation. So all of these issues are interconnected, and the MDBs, the multilateral development banks, to a certain extent, have tried to respond as best as they could with various emergency responses, particularly during COVID, where governments had to procure medical equipment. We've seen in the case of the African Development Bank the additional attention that we're now paying to pharmaceuticals and the ability to manufacture certain, critical medicines in Africa. And we just launched, a foundation to support these pharmaceuticals investments in Africa. And also with the food crisis, being able to procure more resistant seeds, etc. So there are many budget support operations that MDBs use to support countries. who have to react to these emergency situations. But ultimately, as the global economy recovers, we're also seeing faster growth in several African economies. And when you talk about things like green minerals, countries, I think the best performing currency in so far this year has been in Zambia, because they have copper, which is doing very well, and other green minerals like lithium, etc., that you can find in African countries will drive growth. What countries are saying, though, is that we have to add more value before we export these minerals, and governments are reacting accordingly. So there will be, cycles. We see business cycles around the world, but it's important, given Africa's demographic, hopefully dividend with a young population. We expect many of these countries to see faster growth than maybe in the more developed economies. And that translates into more investment into infrastructure, etc. So that would be my response.
Yeah, from AIB side, although we are still quite young, but we have also been collaborated with other multilateral to provide the COVID recovery facility. Progressively, there may be some emergency reaction facility, but I must admit, we are still quite new in this area. So those selected projects we done piloting case to see how best to serve the members. Thank you.
Thank you, Gregory. I'll just jump into one other question here, probably Frederic. This is basically a question here from Abdullah, where he says, how do you recommend or balance the balance between the urgency of fast-track projects to what you need to effectively sort of de-risk investment and ensure sustainable private sector participation, especially considering the potential trade-offs between the speed and risk management in project execution? Looking into de-risking the financing here, but at the same time, there are priorities in the countries in terms of projects that you want to fast track. How do you sort of have that balancing act between the two? I'm just saying, Frederic, but of course, anyone, please, from the panelists, please feel free to jump in.
This is just one, just to start and then hand over to others, that on the private sector operations side, a number of IFIs have blended finance committees. So these committees apply blended finance principles as to how to use, concessional to de-risk projects following certain principles. Urgency is one thing, but you cannot just crowd out otherwise available private sector investment. If a project is commercial, you cannot blend it with concessional. These committees have set up a bit of a jurisprudence in how to actually consider these projects in terms of eligibility. IFC has such a committee, the ADB has one for their private sector operations. I am not sure, I think AIB is considering also issues in terms of setting up policies for, considering concessional to de-risk investments on the private sector side. But over to other colleagues.
And maybe I can add to that.
Yes, please.
As a consultant, we pretty often see different types also of the funding. For instance, in the countries that are just recovering from any crisis or whatsoever, where there's really recovery funds but not on a public or a private funding involved, which are really then MDB funds or unilateral development banks. I know huge credit facilities from Germany as well. And I think then there is rather the long track where really the private funding comes into, because I think looking at the time scale that is needed for implementing the private funding in such infrastructure projects, if there's really a need for a fast track, that would maybe not the first choice. Thank you.
Thank you, Vera. I'll just go into this last question from this. Thank you, everyone. There's loads coming in here. I will now just go into this last one from the chat box. This is from Rupak. He's from India. He mentions in India the PPP BOT was used in the transport sector, but could not be successful in some of the projects, and they are using some hybrid annuity model in transport projects. How do you see it in international context? The annuity project that he rightly mentions here, if I'm correct, I've read an article some months back about what they tagged in as highway robbery, which was, I think, back in the 90s, where the funding was primarily focused into annuity contracting to bring it, because there wasn't that enough contracting capacity or capability within the government. So what the IFIs had actually, and I think it was ADB who was involved in trying to build in that level of capacity, de-risking the finance and getting the private sector involved rather than the public sector, so that in time the private sector raises its capacity and then public sector tax in and gets onto that status, which probably now to speak, in the public sector, it's much stronger in terms of implementing their own projects and all, which is evident from the huge infrastructure improvement. So is that some form of sort of annuity contracting? We do talk about EPC and all back in Africa and all. Just wanted to get your feel, both in Asian context as well as in Africa context, from all of you. Quickly, I guess this is the last one.
Perhaps I could briefly come in. I mean, this is an important question, and I see it as really being about one of the major aspects of PPPs, and that's risk allocation. And I think in the India case, especially in these road concessions, there has been a little bit of evolution in terms of who bears what risks, whether it's NHAI, the government, or whether it's the private sector. And they did experiment a little bit in terms of finding the right balance. The hybrid annuity model today, it has, I think, has been successful. It's actually being replicated in India in the water sector as well. So if we look at it as a principle of, risk reward allocation, who takes traffic risk, for example, what is the government contribution to a particular project, again taking into project affordability constraints. I think that perspective is highly replicable in the international context. For example, I think it's fair to say today it's very rare to find private sector that's going to take traffic risk on a new road. So clearly, different models are needed, which still put the operational risk onto the private sector, but strike a more equitable risk allocation so that the project is bankable, but not giving oversized returns to the private sector either.
Thank you. Just adding to that, Şebnem, I was gonna, do you think this evolves over time phase? If the annuity hybrid was working in the transport sector in India, is that sort of, goes into, say, a decade of those practice? Primarily, the reason I say is the capacity of the public sector and how the private sector also operates sort of evolves over time. So it's probably no longer applicable, which might be applicable to similar developing economy. So is that sort of, time-bound kind of thing, which evolve over a period as to what can be practiced?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that these models need to be evaluated in the context of the particular country, the sector that we are looking to address, as well as the specific project, because, in project finance, the devil is in the detail. There's certainly an evolution, but again, one would have to look at it, I think, on a case-by-case basis. I mean, we're talking transport here from one road to another or one port to another. The dynamics could change substantially. But perhaps others would like to come in on that as well. Thank you.
If I bring some perspective from the energy side, one question we regularly ask client from the private sector and client from the public sector is, what's this long-term sustainable tariff? Because it's driven by so many factors, the fuel cost, financing cost, etc. in different country, due to the different element they can get access to, the sustainable tariff could be slightly different. So it's a bit like a PPP. One PPP can have many different derivatives in different countries. Hope that helped.
Thank you, everyone. I think I'll have to bring this to a close now. Personally, Gregory, I have a question for you in my pocket, which I'll send it to you later. That's which is my personal question, which was definitely to do with the country rating, sovereign rating. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. It was very insightful. I know it wasn't enough. We could go on. I think it was just started to get into the rhythm. Thank you for your time, and we've learned. I'm sure the participants benefited a lot out of this. So I will now pass on the floor to Luis to make some concluding remark.
Thank you very much, Suraj. My congratulations to you and all the speakers for the brilliant presentations you have given us and for your answers to our audience questions. With this, we finish this FIDIC webinar. But I don't want to end without thanking Ben Lee again for their continued support and trust in FIDIC, and thanking you all for your presence in this webinar, reminding you that the FIDIC webinar program will continue and that in 2 weeks, we will celebrate another excellent webinar organized by the Future Leaders Committee. So we wait for you. Keep in touch with FIDIC. Thank you very much again, and see you soon. Bye-bye.